Hello everyone, and welcome back to Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Well, today we're going to hang out with Bertie and Elizabeth during the most scary times in their life, World War II. The return home from Canada and the United States was a joyous one. They had been away from their home and daughters for 7 long weeks. Lilibet and Margaret raced up to the wooden steps, and Margaret shouted, "Hello!" at the top of her voice, and Lilibet yelled out, "Hello, Mummy!" And when they got to the deck, they ran up to their parents and kissed and hugged them over and over. According to the book George VI and Elizabeth, the king couldn't keep his eyes off of Lilibet. They returned back to the Buckingham Palace, with the princesses riding with their parents at the head of the carriage procession. The crowd was cheering, and Bertie was smiling, and he raised his hand to the crowd. Elizabeth looked very happy too. There were 50,000 people at the gates. That's a lot of people. And the king and queen went out to the balcony with the princesses, and the crowd got really loud. And this happened about 9 p.m. Neville Chamberlain thought the trip gave the king increased confidence, and it helped in his ease with the crowds. George VI told the Canadian Governor-General that everybody here says that our tour has done untold good to the people of Canada, and I can tell you that our tour has done me untold good in every way. And the queen even felt empowered by the visits. She realized her image and her personality, and she knew how it was to get the right kind of publicity. Now the war begins. August the 22nd, 1939, Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression pact, and they did this in secret. They wanted to invade Poland and split the attacks between them. Neville Chamberlain knew that it would mean Britain would help in protecting Poland. The king tried to find a peaceful resolution, and the king wanted to go meet with Hitler personally to appeal to him, but Chamberlain said no politely to that suggestion. So the British government was looking for peace, and so was Franklin Roosevelt and Pope Pius XII. The Duke of Windsor got involved too. He sent a telegram to Hitler, and Edward said the telegram stated, "As a citizen of the world, not to plunge the world in war," and Hitler replied he never wanted a war with England, and if it took place it would not be his fault. So it was at this time that the idea came to mind that Edward would need to be in England for his safety. The private secretary was speaking frequently to the Duke from the 10 Downing Street, trying to make arrangements for Edward's return. The private secretary offered him an airplane and personal pilot to get him to Antibes. The arrangements were canceled when the former king refused to come unless he could stay at Windsor or one of the royal castles. All this talk was making Queen Elizabeth a little nervous. She wrote Queen Mary a letter on August 31st saying, "What are we going to do about Mrs. S? Personally, I do not wish to receive her at all, though it must depend on circumstances. I am afraid that if they do return, they will wriggle their way into things. It is a very, very difficult position and a great nuisance, with many pitfalls." So now the war begins. The Germans surged across the Polish border on September the 1st, and Britain and France stated that Hitler needed to withdraw his troops by 11 a.m. on September the 3rd, or they would declare war. So the king and the queen went to bed with sad hearts, and she told Lionel Logue, who was Bertie's speech therapist and friend, that the king didn't get much sleep because he was so worried. Throughout the morning, Elizabeth made note of everything that occurred that morning in peace, and she stated, "We've only have a few hours of peace left." And she counted down the hours until 11 a.m. in her diary, and she clocked the last cup of tea and the last bath in peace, and she thought of the British people. Their courage, their humor, their sense of right and wrong. She felt that they would come through the wicked things that war lets loose. Elizabeth went to the sitting room to be with Bertie at 10:30 a.m., and the king at this time began writing in his diary. He wrote in it throughout the war and 2 years after the war. When 11 a.m. came and went, Bertie felt a sense of relief until 15 minutes later, when Neville Chamberlain came on the radio to say that Britain was at war. Elizabeth and Bertie, though, agreed that if there was any freedom left in our world, we must face the cruel Nazi creed and rid ourselves of this continual nightmare of force. The king stated to himself, "The country is calm, firm, and united behind its leaders." Soon afterwards, air raid sirens went off. The king and queen went down to the palace basement, which had been set up for them. Elizabeth wrote, "We felt stunned and horrified, waiting for the bombs to fall." Bertie and Elizabeth had been trained in the air raid precautions, and they took their gas masks with them to the basement. Elizabeth had written in her diary that when they returned to their rooms, we prayed with all our hearts that peace would come about. Real peace, not a Nazi peace. So Bertie was to give a speech that night on the radio to the Empire. The speech therapist Logue got there with a half an hour to spare, and Logue reviewed the speech and made it easier for Bertie to do the speech. So it was a beautiful speech that lasted under 6 minutes. When it was finished, Elizabeth told him, "That was good, Bertie." And Queen Mary told Bertie that he came through very well, and then she said, "Of course I wept. Your voice is so like dear Papa's." So 8 months went by with the United Kingdom expecting invasions by Hitler that didn't come. They were starting to call it the phony war. The country was on high alert, and nerves were on edge, which was to be expected. There was blackout paper that covered all windows, trenches, and air raid shelters, and more than 1 million children were sent to the countryside for their protection. Gasoline rations were started, and food rationing a few weeks after that. So the king and the queen, they sent Margaret and Elizabeth to Scotland so they would be cared for by Elizabeth's sister Rose. Alla Knight was going to be there along with their tutor Crawfy and Madame Monton Smith, the French tutor, so they would still be having school lessons. Bertie and Elizabeth missed their daughters so much that they would call them every day at 6 p.m. The queen told Crawfy to stick with the usual program. The princesses had cousins to play with, they rode ponies and had picnics, and they also signed up with the local Girl Guide troop. The London skies had gray barrage balloons, which were inflatable devices designed to disrupt low-flying dive bombers. Buckingham Palace took down the crystal chandeliers in the stateroom, and they were sent out to the country for storage. They also sent their chinaware, furniture, and other precious objects. Priceless art collections were tagged and cataloged and placed buried in distant caves. Sandbags were placed around the palace. Windsor Castle did the same thing. Anti-aircraft guns were installed on the grounds and in barrels next to the tombs. Air raid shelters were placed in the former basement dungeons, and they had glass cabinets placed against the walls. Dust sheets went over the remaining furniture. The castle windows were blacked out with paper and paint along with wire mesh. There was so much preparations to protect items. 2 chambers were dug at the castle to hide the crown jewels. Unmarked cars from Garrett Jewelers transported them from London to Windsor. There the king and Owen Morshed, the royal librarian, used pliers to wrench the major gems off their settings, and they were wrapped in cotton wool. Other jewels went in leather hat boxes, and other jewels went into cookie tins. The king and queen decided they would stay in Buckingham Palace as long as they could. If the raids got worse, they would go to Windsor or even further out. The king was afraid for his mother, Queen Mary, and moved her from Marlborough House to Gloucester to stay with her niece, Mary. So Queen Mary took everything but the kitchen sink with her. She had a fleet of automobiles with 55 servants and 70 pieces of luggage. Once Mary got there, she knitted, she did crossword puzzles, and delved into the Beaufort family archives to label and organize every paper she could find. It sounded like Queen Mary could never be still. She also went to work stripping ivy from the walls, and she would clear brush, bramble, branches, and tree limbs. In this task, she got servants and guardsmen and local children to help. On their breaks, Queen Mary handed out cigarettes, and they smoked while she talked. The first part of the war, when there weren't any raids, Queen Mary got to London almost every week, and she would have lunch with Bertie and Elizabeth. In Gloucester, she visited troops, hospitals, schools, and factories. She promoted and practiced a salvage scheme to collect scrap iron, bottles, and other trash for the war effort. So at this time, Edward and Wallace made their way from the south of France to England, and they got there on September the 1st, and they went to stay with their friends Fruity and Lady Alexandra Medcalf. 2 days later, David went to Buckingham Palace to see Bertie. It was the first time since December the 11th, 1936. The brothers spent an hour together with no accusations on either side. Bertie wrote that Edward displayed his familiar, unnerving swagger. He tried to lay down the law, and Bertie wrote that David seemed to be thinking of only himself and had forgotten what he'd done to the country in 1936. Edward thought of Bertie as being weak. Windsor wanted to serve his country during the war, so he and Bertie explored what he could do. There was 2 choices, a civilian job in Wales or a military position in Paris. Edward wanted to stay in Wales so he could get himself able to live in England. This wasn't agreeable to Bertie or Elizabeth. Bertie had him thinking by saying, what would his reception by the people be like, and how would they react to Wallace? So that changed Edward's mind, and he decided to go to Paris as a military person. The king told Neville Chamberlain that the sooner David went to France, the better. Bertie said David isn't wanted here. Bertie was wise to David, and he told the war minister, Leslie Hoare Belcher, that he didn't want David attached to any unit of the British Army. He thought that David was very much alive and after his job. General Sir Edmund Ironside felt that if David would get a hold of secret plans of the French, he would pass them on to his wife. Ironside didn't trust Wallace Simpson, and Ironside was told by the king not to tell Edward anything or show him anything that was really secret. So there was no longer any loving feelings between the Duke. There was a mutual distrust. David and Wallace knew that Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth didn't want to see Wallace. Elizabeth made it known before they got to England. Elizabeth sent a message to Wallace saying she was sorry she couldn't receive her. She wanted to make her feelings clear. And when David was at the palace, David asked about his brothers, Henry and George, but he didn't ask about any female member of the family. Queen Mary told Bertie over lunch she had no intention of seeing David if she could avoid it, and the king assured her she didn't have to. Elizabeth was glad that Wallace kept her distance, and she hoped that the Duke at last realized that there was no niche for them there. So Elizabeth wrote that she strongly believed the British had not forgiven what he did to this country, and they hate her. Hate with capital H-A-T-E. What a curse black sheep are in a family. David and Wallace had planned on staying a month in England, but after the reception they got when they arrived, they only stayed for 2 weeks. So I'm going to end the video here. The war in England didn't begin right away, but England was bracing for it. So I didn't realize how much work went into defending and protecting the castles and the valuables. Queen Mary was a trooper and kept busy at her new temporary residence, and the king and queen were busy preparing for war too. They had sent their daughters away, but they were having fun with relatives and activities, which was good. The reunion between the brothers didn't go as well for David as he hoped for. Bertie could see what David was up to, and he was stronger than David imagined by holding his ground and not letting him take an inch. I hope everyone enjoyed the video, and if you did, if you could give it a thumbs up, it would be greatly appreciated. The next video will have us joining the king and queen when the war started to hit home. I hope everybody has been having a good day. Tune in again soon for another episode of Queen Elizabeth, A Day in Her Life. Thank you. Bye.